Good morning, everybody. My name is Sam Adams, and I'm the head of the U.S. Climate Initiative for WRI, the World Resources Institute. And for those of you here in the room watching live stream online and the viewers of C-SPAN 2, I'd like to welcome you to our announcement and discussion of the findings of our most recent research, delivering on the U.S. climate commitment, a 10-point plan towards a low-carbon future. You can download the complete research report at wri.org/publications. About us, WRI is a global nonprofit, non-governmental organization that works closely with world leaders to address urban global challenges at the intersection of economic development and the natural environment. At the U.S. Climate Initiative program within WRI, we use vigorous, independent research and strategic partnerships to help advance the United States transition to a strong, low-carbon economy. And up front, I want to thank the research team of the U.S. Climate Initiative that completed the study that we are here to discuss today. And if I could have them stand. Carl Hausker, the lead author of this research study, and co-authors Kristen Meek, Rebecca Gasper, Nate Aden, and Michael Obieder. Thank you very much for your work. Right there. We are focused on this issue because of the need to address climate change, an urgent need to address climate change. Since 1980, get both slides up here. Since 1980, over $1 trillion has been lost to climate disasters in the US, and since 2011, more than $200 billion in losses have occurred due to climate events in the United States. In March of this year, the United States put forward a serious proposal to slash its carbon emissions 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2030. Effectively doubling the speed of emission reductions compared to its last international pledge. If successful, not only will this help mitigate climate change, but the U.S. submission could offer real momentum to global climate negotiations, but only if it is a credible proposal. And that is the research that we undertook. We applied robust independent analysis on whether and how the U.S. administration can deliver on its climate targets. The scope of the research included looking at elements of the 2013 U.S. Climate Action Plan, including the strengthened CAFE standards, the proposed Clean Power Plan, and the proposed SNAP rules on HFC. We also researched and analyzed state efforts that are underway, including the Renewable Portfolio Standards, the Energy Efficiency Research Standards, and market-based systems that are putting a price on carbon in California and the 9 northeastern states of RGGI. This work that we're talking about today, this research work by the U.S. Climate Initiative, builds on research that this team has been doing since 2003. And that work, in turn, builds on decades of really fantastic work at WRI. And I'd like to note that a previous WRI president is here. He has been instrumental in shaping WRI into what it is today. And please join me in recognizing also a member of our board of directors, Jonathan Lash. Jonathan, thank you. The work that you see on the screen and that I just mentioned also included work of former U.S. Climate Initiative and WRI staffers that deserve recognition as well, who are here today: Nicholas Bianco, John Larson, James Bradbury, and Stephanie Damasa. Thank you all for your work. And now, on with the program. Soon you're going to hear from Carl, who's going to give us an overview of the research findings, and that'll be followed by a panel discussion, which will include Q&A and discussion from the audience. Not only will you have a chance to ask Carl questions about the research findings, but then you'll be able to engage in the deeper conversation with the panel. The panel will be moderated by Suzanne Goldenberg, the U.S. Environment Correspondent for The Guardian, and will include panelists Rick Duke, Deputy Director of Climate Policy, the White House Office of Energy and Climate Change, Richard Kaufman, Chairman of Energy and Finance for New York, Office of New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, John Cookett, Director of Federal and International Climate Campaigns for the Sierra Club, and Mark Wagner, Vice President of Government Affairs for Johnson Controls. WRI is live tweeting today's event at our WRI Climate account, and you can join the online discussion by using the hashtag lowcarbonfuture. All right, now on with the program. He's worked for 28 years in the fields of climate change, energy, and the environment in a career that has spanned legislative and executive branches, research institutions, NGOs, and consulting. He's a certified smart person, and he is our lead author. Please join me in welcoming Carl Hausker.
Thank you, Sam. And it's always interesting to be at an event like this where you see those 28 years flash before you with all my colleagues in the audience. I appreciate you coming out today. We addressed two broad questions in this study. First is, using existing federal authorities combined with state actions, what pathways could the U.S. take to meet that 26 to 28% reduction target set by this administration? And the second question is, looking beyond 2025 and assuming that new legislative authority is possible in future years, what pathways could the U.S. take to move toward a low-carbon economy in 2030, 2040, and beyond? I'm going to start by just giving an overview of our key findings. The U.S. has set an ambitious target, but it is achievable. We can meet or exceed that 26 to 28% target for 2025. As Sam noted, there's a wide range of actions already underway, but the U.S. will need to expand and strengthen some of the current and proposed policies already in the pipeline, and the U.S. will need to take action on some emission sources not yet addressed. Looking at that second research question, going beyond 2025, we know that deeper reductions are necessary to move toward a further decarbonization later in the century, and we have explored some pathways that can get us there while still maintaining a growing economy and good employment levels. We explored some pathways that put a price on carbon combined with other complementary policies and found that we could hit emission reductions of 40% or more by 2030, 50% or more by 2040, all consistent with good GDP growth and employment. So we'll come to both of these. We're first going to talk about the analysis and modeling approach we took on the 26 to 28% target. An analysis like this always begins with a reference case projection or a business as usual projection of what happens under the current policy regime. In each case, in all these figures that you see here, we take a net GHG emissions approach. It includes a reference case level of sequestration. We relied largely on our reference case on projections from the 2014 Annual Energy Outlook and other government sources, particularly EPA projections of the non-CO2 gases. So this means that our reference case includes various standards and policies that were finalized and in place before 2014. But the reference case excludes proposed standards that are in the pipeline, very significant ones, of course, like the Clean Power Plan. So as you see in the figure, we have a historical 2005 levels of about 6,500 million metric tons, and we look at current emissions of roughly 6,000 million metric tons with fairly slow growth heading into the future. So by 2025, our reference case projection is a little under 6,400 million metric tons. So to hit a target of 26% below that, we would need to reduce emissions about 1,600 million tons below that number by 2025. So what are the pathways that we explored that could hit that target? The first pathway we explored we call the core ambition pathway. In this pathway, we assumed that EPA will implement the Clean Power Plan as proposed, and then we added a portfolio of other ambitious policies covering almost every other sector of the economy. And when we ran that through our model, we could reach the 26% reduction. Two other pathways we explored. The first we call the power sector push pathway. In this pathway, we assume that EPA finalizes a somewhat stronger Clean Power Plan or strengthens it over time to reduce emissions to a greater extent in the power sector, capturing some of that additional renewable energy potential and energy efficiency potential that still remains even if they did the Clean Power Plan as is currently proposed. So when we pushed harder on the power sector but maintained the other core ambition assumptions, we could get as high as a 30% reduction by the year 2025. The third pathway we explored, we asked, could we also get to the range of 30% even with the Clean Power Plan as currently proposed? And there, we pushed a little harder in 4 areas: in transportation, on both vehicle efficiency and travel demand, on industrial energy efficiency, and finally in natural gas consumption in residential commercial buildings. And with that extra push in those sectors, we were also able to reach a 30% reduction by the year 2025. When we ran the numbers out to 2030, we got in the range of a 34 to 38% reduction below 2005 levels. And the blue shading on this graph also just implies that these policies are scalable. There's nothing magical about those 3 pathways, but you could mix a portfolio of policies that we've examined to reach anywhere in there. Where do the tons come from? In this figure, we show the percentage contribution by various sectors that we analyzed in the sector policies. You'll see the 3 largest contributors to the 1,600-ton reduction are the power sector, reductions in HFCs, and reductions in the industrial sector, with other sectors, natural gas systems, vehicles, methane from landfill coal mines, and other areas contributing also significant slices. How do we get there? We've put together a 10-point action plan that can reach into the 26 to 30% range. And it addresses almost all sectors: transportation, power, residential, commercial, industry, all the CO2 emitting sectors. It also covers the non-CO2 gases that are unrelated to fossil fuel use. One important area that we did not develop policy options is agriculture and forestry. Agricultural emissions, methane, N2O, and enhancing the sequestration in forests and soils. It's very significant to note, although we covered much of what's possible, we didn't cover that area, and it's very significant that just last month, the administration announced the Smart Agriculture and Forestry Initiative, and they estimate that they can reduce emissions about 120 million tons through that. So there's different ways to reach these low carbon pathways, including adding one sector that we didn't look into. So the 10-point action plan is covered in your executive summary. I'm not going to cover the whole thing, but let's touch on those 3 biggest sectors. Power sector, responsible for about 42% of the total reduction that we model in the core ambition pathway. Here we know that there are multiple factors leading already to the decarbonization of the power sector. And we know that the Clean Power Plan will accelerate these changes, but there's still some potential left there, particularly in the area of energy efficiency and renewables. So our first action item is to strengthen the Clean Power Plan in the near term or over time to fully reflect that potential. Second action point affecting the power sector is to scale up the programs for residential and commercial energy efficiency. Both of those can combine to achieve some deep reductions in the power sector. The second sector I'll talk about is HFCs, or hydrofluorocarbons. Here we know HFC consumption is still growing relatively strongly as HFCs replace the ozone-depleting substances that are causing problems. We know that EPA is taking action already through its SNAP program and through rules that reduce HFC use in vehicles, but there's more to do here too. And so our third action item is to expand and continue these aggressive programs to reduce HFC emissions. And then the third sector we talk about is industry. Strong growth in emissions here is expected, and that's good. There's a rebirth of US manufacturing going on due to abundant natural gas and a return to economic growth levels. That also creates potential for reducing these emissions. There's potential to tap into the kind of potential that the National Academy of Sciences has identified is possible in the industrial sector. There's levers here. The EPA has broad Clean Air Act authority to address industrial emissions. And we also know that DOE and states have programs that can spur reductions here as well. So our fourth action item is to use that authority to set emission standards in the industrial sector and ramp up voluntary programs, informational, benchmarking, labeling, to help improve industrial efficiency and reduce emissions from that sector. So now let me turn to that second question, looking beyond 2025, where we know that deeper reductions are needed. There is a limit to what can be done with existing federal authority combined with state action. And eventually, Congress is going to have to engage on this issue and become really part of the solution. We also know that there's growing support for putting a price on carbon through a tax mechanism, through cap and trade systems, and serious people both on the left and the right, in both parties, in business, in environmental groups, know that putting a price on carbon is part of the long-term solution. We know that carbon prices reduces emissions, and we know it's also compatible with robust economic growth. And why do we know this? There's evidence from our experience in the US with the two systems that Sam mentioned, as well as experience in other countries. And we also know it from independent and credible modeling of what carbon pricing can do and what its effect is on the economy. So we explored some carbon price pathways. We explored them combined with targeted complementary policies in other sectors. We looked at carbon prices that are similar to the kind of social cost of carbon estimates the administration has put out, similar to the EIA side cases of what carbon prices could look like starting at $25 a ton and accelerating. We assumed that the carbon prices would start in the year 2020, several years out. We found that we could reduce emissions by 40 to 42% below 2005 levels by 2030, increasing to 50 to 53% by 2040. Those go beyond what we can do simply with existing federal authority and state actions. The GDP and employment impacts of taking these paths show little impact in the near term and virtually no impact in the long term. And that's consistent with other credible modeling efforts that have addressed these questions. We also find that in some pathways, in some scenarios, the combination of aggressive energy efficiency programs, even combined with carbon pricing, can actually result in lower bills, the residential sector, commercial sector, and overall transportation expenditures. And that's consistent with some of the analysis that EPA did for the Clean Power Plan. So just to recap our key findings, the US has put out an ambitious target. It is achievable if we work hard. We can meet or exceed that 26 to 28% goal. A lot is going on already. Based on the 2013 Climate Action Plan and other initiatives that have been announced since then, we need to expand on those, strengthen those. We need to take action on emission sources not yet addressed, and we can get there. Beyond 2025, those deeper reductions are necessary. Carbon pricing is a key to reaching those deeper reductions, and we know that it can be done while still having a healthy economy. So I'll stop there. Again, thank you for coming. I'll take a couple of clarifying questions before turning it back over to Sam. It was so clear, there's no clarifying questions. Yes, sir.
You did all the study, but you did not mention the cost. Who's going to pay for it? How do you finance it?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, so you mentioned all these studies, but you did not mention who's going to pay for it and how do you recover the cost? Who's going to pay for all that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Under our low carbon pathways to reach 26 to 28%, there's a variety of standard setting that would occur in different sectors under authority at EPA or DOE or other agencies, and there would also be non-regulatory programs that would be financed by the federal government. None of these do we find excessively expensive. In fact, from an economy-wide point of view, so many of these measures save energy, save natural gas, save electricity, save gasoline, reduce natural gas leakage, and create more saleable commodities by pipelines in the natural gas industry. So many of these come in at negative cost or zero cost. Yes?
Could you just briefly talk about why you didn't include agricultural policy?
Mm-hmm.
My name is Christine Driscoll. I work for Green Strategies.
Mm-hmm. Just in terms of the scope of what we are undertaking and the capacities we had at WRI, we did not explore that area. Yes?
Can you say a few words about what kind of a modeling framework you used for doing?
Mm-hmm.
Can you repeat the question real quick?
Hi. Could you say a few words about what kind of a modeling framework you used to do this analysis?
Yeah. All of the details are laid out in the report. Briefly, we have an internal WRI model that can project emissions, and we also used NEMS in collaboration with Duke University. And I'll just take this minute to also thank Eitan Gumerman at Duke University and also Marilyn Brown at Georgia Tech, both of whom helped us with the modeling.
We'll have more Q&A after the panel discussion. So thank you, Carl.
Okay.
Appreciate it. All right, I'd like to introduce our moderator, who will then call up the panelists and provides a little more bio on each. She is the U.S. Environment Correspondent for The Guardian and is based in Washington, D.C. She's known as a tough, incisive, and reporter. She has won several awards for her work in the Middle East, and in 2003 covered the U.S. invasion of Iraq from Baghdad. She's also author of Madam President, about Hillary Clinton's historic run for the White House. Suzanne, thanks for being here. Thanks for moderating.
Hi, thank you so much, everybody, for coming here. I think it's going to be a great panel. This is a really exciting year, as everyone knows, for climate change. And for those of us who live in this space, it's been busier than ever because of the prospects of the Paris Climate Conference, the idea that we are now very close towards reaching a very important global deal on climate change that could indeed limit warming to 2 degrees Celsius, which is the internationally agreed safe limit for global warming. So it's a very busy year on climate change, and I'm so excited that we're here with some of the people who are really in the thick of things here and who will help determine what happens at Paris, whether Paris produces a very strong agreement that can keep the world safe from future climate change, or whether it will fall short of those goals. So I'm going to be bringing up the panelists now. I'm going to be starting with Rick Duke, who works on energy and climate change at the White House, and who is deeply involved with every aspect of President Obama's very ambitious climate plan that was rolled out 2 years ago. We've got coming in at the extreme left, we've got Carl, but just strictly at the left of the panel, there's no, it's just a placement issue. Carl Hausker, who you've just heard from. You've got Mark Wagner, who's the Vice President of Government Affairs at Johnson Controls. If you're not familiar with Johnson Controls, it is deeply involved with producing the sort of next generations of technology, especially car batteries that are going to change the way we live, and that will also determine whether we get to this space. We've got Richard Kaufman, who's the Chairman of Energy and Finance for New York State. You've heard about California being a leader on green issues. Well, New York is doing a lot too, and we'll hopefully get the chance to hear from him. And we've got Rick Duke, as I said, and here beside me is John Cookett, who's the Director of Federal and International Programs at the Sierra Club, and who's been monitoring the talks at Paris and also the actions here by government and industry for the past several years, and we'll be looking at it in the time ahead. So I'm going to take my place in the middle of the panel. And I thought, you know, after that great, there's so much sort of gloom and doom also in this space. So it was great to hear from Carl that that there is a very clear path for the U.S. to reach its climate goals. And I wanted to sort of start off with you, Rick, and sort of ask you how, what the administration can do now to sort of defend the actions that have been taken already from attacks that we know are coming from, from Congress and the courts, and from an uncertain future after 2016. How can the White House act now to defend what's been accomplished so far, and what more can we expect to sort of move towards that clean energy future?
Thank you, Suzanne, and good morning, everyone. I think it's important just to step back and set a little bit of context about the president's action on climate change over the course of the 2 terms. And when you go back to the beginning of the first term, at that point in time, our emissions were projected to grow indefinitely through time. And instead of accepting that, the president set an ambitious goal to cut emissions 17% by 2020, and then started a whole series of actions in the first term to deliver those results. At the beginning of the second term, he came forward with a strong statement on climate change in his inaugural address, followed shortly thereafter by the historic Climate Action Plan in June of 2013. And what we're seeing is that poll after poll shows that Americans support climate action. They support strong action on climate. And measures like historic fuel economy standards delivered during the first term, appliance efficiency standards, doubling renewable electricity during the first term, and a whole suite of other measures that are in motion under the Climate Action Plan are cutting energy waste, they're saving consumers money, and they're delivering both carbon pollution reduction and public health benefits. So our intention is to continue acting, continue to deliver what we've promised under the Climate Action Plan, and hit our targets accordingly. And we think the public is with us.
But are there any specific actions that how can we ensure that these actions taken are going to be safe from challenge in the courts, are going to be safe from challenge by Republicans in Congress?
When you look at the full set of things that are in motion consistent with the President's Climate Action Plan, first, it's just important to recognize that it's a comprehensive approach to make steady progress across all sectors and all greenhouse gases. And so in that sense, it's a diversified approach. We have fuel economy standards, HFCs related action, methane related action, the EPA's Clean Power Plan, cutting energy waste, scaling clean energy, and delivering consumer savings and these public health benefits and economic growth at the same time. And so any one of those measures may be subject to one challenge or another. but we'll continue to proceed with the progress across all those different measures, and we're confident that they'll be successful. When you look at the specific question around litigation, here I think it's important to recall that the Environmental Protection Agency has a multi-decade track record of success in important public health projects like cutting particulate matter, SOx and NOx and the like, 80% reductions in sulfur dioxide over a period of decades. And yes, there was litigation and there was challenge to what EPA was doing over that period, but ultimately they've been successful and the economy has continued to expand robustly and we've delivered those public health benefits. We think we'll see similar success going forward on key elements of the Climate Action Plan across the board.
Thank you. And from, you know, from the presentation that Carl lined out just now, are there any specific measures from the presentation there that you think that the White House can, the administration can embark on now in the time remaining to get to that 26 to 28% target? If you had to choose one or two from that list.
Well, I think it's important to note that it's already a 10-part list on the WRI report. The 10th on the list was the one that I would mention because, as Carl indicated, that was sort of the everything else bucket. And it's notable, as Carl already indicated, that just a few weeks ago, Secretary Vilsack put forward a comprehensive plan to drive down emissions in the agricultural sector through a whole set of existing programs and voluntary efforts, but robust engagement of the agricultural sector. We see now contributing up to 2% economy-wide reductions in greenhouse gases by 2025. And so that's an example of the comprehensive nature of the engagement that we're doing across all sectors and all greenhouse gases. The President has challenged each of his cabinet secretaries and the entire administration to look for every stone that can be uncovered, every opportunity that we can pursue. And we expect to complete a very robust set of measures on our remaining watch. And I think the Secretary of Agriculture's leadership in this domain is a good example of what can be accomplished.
John, when you, as somebody who's followed the progress of the talks, you know, when you're in the corridors there at these various venues, you hear, I hear people saying, we're not sure that the U.S. can really deliver. Based on what you're hearing from the White House, based on, you know, the WR plan, do you think, are you confident that the administration can deliver on these goals?
That's a tough question. So I think what we see here and what we see, you know, Rick speaking to and where the administration is, I think that they have absolutely the commitment that is required to achieve the targets that they've set. I think it's important when we take our steps back and look around to see the incredible opposition that exists. And the potential for delay there is not small. I think that countries should recognize that every country has their own national circumstances. Every country has their political problems that they have to overcome. The United States is no different from any other country on that front. I mean, we've seen in the recent elections in the UK, challenges there as well. So I guess my reaction would be that the US is negotiating in absolute positive and good interest. They have no intention of putting numbers on the table that they don't think can be met. But they also put on the table some really robust standards and some really difficult goals to achieve. And that's what everyone wanted from the US. So I think the fact that it's hard to say exactly how we get there and that there's some question on the table as to whether or not these goals are achievable and there's some question as to whether additional legislative authority is required to meet them is a good thing. And countries should feel emboldened that the US didn't put the same kind of weak standards that we used to put on the table in the past administration. I don't know if anyone, how many people remember the, you know, intensity-based targets of the Bush administration, and then they would go to the cops and just roll out, you know, slick-looking things like this that just recounted all of the good work that the states were doing. So, you know, we're in a very different place now, but we continue to have a lot of challenges in front of us, and I think any country evaluating where the US is just has to recognize that.
If one of the things that in the lead up to the Paris climate talks we're hearing about is the importance of the business sector in reaching these goals and getting a strong agreement. How important is it to see strong direction from the administration and on climate issues, and how does that help or business?
Well, I think leadership is critical in being able to follow through on any of these things and reach success. You know, we're a global company, and when I look at these recommendations, I find we're deeply involved in 5 of them as a business. We're working with states right now on the Clean Power Plan and building Block 4. The EPA proposed regs to try to find innovative ways to have energy efficiency as a compliance option. We're scaling up our commercial building energy efficiency programs. We make chillers and air conditioners, and we're committed to reducing the GWP in our HFCs for our refrigerants. We're using in our own manufacturing, in our industrial usage, we're looking at reducing how our emissions from our factories. We've committed to a 25% reduction over 10 years. Halfway through that, we're already at 21%, so it is achievable. And finally, you mentioned batteries. We're making advanced batteries, both lithium-ion and start-stop batteries all over the world to reduce emissions from vehicles, in the electrification of the vehicles. So there's any number of points in here that we as a business community, that a lot of the policies are driving a lot of this technology.
Especially in areas, I guess, of the automotive and in terms of cars?
Exactly. You mentioned, again, our batteries. Yes, we make lithium-ion batteries for hybrids and electric vehicles, but we also have been making in Europe a lot of what's known as start-stop, where once you put your foot on the brake, the engine shuts off and reduces the idling time, and you take your foot off the brake, the engine starts back up. Europe's been at that for quite some time. At least 60% of the new cars in Europe are start-stop. Now coming to the United States, where you see a lot more of the newer vehicles are turning to be start-stop. The Chevy Malibu, the Ford F-150 truck. A lot more cars you're going to see are switching to start-stop mode. So not only are we working on the hybrid side of the equation, we're looking at the very vast majority of the vehicles that are still being produced out there year over year. 95% of the vehicles are still internal combustion engine. So a start-stop vehicle can reduce emissions and fuel economy by 5%. And that's a huge chunk if you can start to tackle the new car fleet that's still out there.
And Richard, how engaged have people of New York State been in this issue, especially in the wake of Sandy? I mean, how big a priority is it? And what kind of shift have you seen in public opinion in New York State as regards climate action since Sandy?
Okay, great. Thanks. Well, I was a colleague of Rick Duke's at the Department of Energy, and so now going to the States, one of the things that I'm concerned about is we're here from the federal government and here to help. And so actually one of the great things about 111D is that states have a tremendous amount of latitude in terms of how to implement the proposed rules.
111D being the Clean Power Plan.
So it's a very good, we really appreciate that at the state level because states really, as Justice Brandeis pointed out, states are often the laboratories of democracy, and so there's a range of policy innovation going on at different states. So maybe I can talk a little bit about what we're doing. So the Governor Cuomo actually called me right after Sandy because I was working in Washington, and he said the electricity sector is still operating in the vinyl record days in the age of the iPod. And that's really true, not only in terms of resilience, but in many respects. And so while climate is a central part of what we're trying to do in New York State, it's kind of the good news here is there are lots of other reasons why we're embarked upon a very significant change in our power sector, because we're not only have not been on a path that is sustainable from an environmental standpoint, we're not on a path that's economically sustainable because we pay high costs for electricity in the state, and in so while generation costs have moderated because of the benefits of natural gas, the costs of transmission and distribution continue to go up. And that infrastructure costs, we have an aging infrastructure. Lots of places in the United States have aging T&D infrastructure. We've spent $17 billion in the last 10 years, and it's going to go to $30 billion in the next 10 years. And that's, and we're building, or not building the kind of grid of today or tomorrow. We're rebuilding the grid of yesterday, which is a grid which has very, very low capacity utilization, only has 55% capacity utilization. So it's built for the hottest couple of days during the year. So we have a system which is both energy inefficient as well as capital inefficient. And so there was a question before about who's going to pay for all this. Well, actually, we have a pretty meaningful cost envelope that can be used to finance an energy system which is going to be more energy efficient, save customers money, and actually and be more resilient.
A lot of people will have followed the decision that New York State took for the moratorium on fracking. That, you know, and that New York State will not allow fracking. Mm-hmm. How does that, if at all, work in with your energy picture, your energy use picture?
Well, so that was a recommendation by the Public Health Commissioner. So I'm not going to really talk specifically about that decision. What I would say generally is that it's very important to think about an electricity sector that is not a purely a production-based system, because that's what we have today. We have a system, electricity system. We talk about one of the key pathways here is attacking the power sector. So the power sector still is built, this largely central station generation and distribution system was built at a time when electrons only flowed one way, and when demand was seen to be fixed. So today's 85 degrees, tomorrow will be 90 degrees. We have to generate power based upon that forecast of the day forward. And as opposed to what the technology today permits, companies like Johnson Controls and others actually permit a networked grid that is a little bit more like when we think about the IT system. That's a network where we have the benefits of the mainframe and the cloud, but combined with the flexibility of the PC. That kind of network grid is the kind of grid that we should be building, which has a combination, which gives the benefits of the central station, plus the benefits of distributed energy resources in supporting the grid and making the grid more capital efficient. But we're not.
But
sorry, go ahead.
in terms of, I mean, what would you tell people about the decision on fracking and what it means?
So I guess the point that I'm making is that we want to have a system which better matches supply and demand. And that's a system which is not just a production-led system, but one which will be one which is more energy efficient and more capital efficient. It's both a supply and demand-based solution, and that's sort of the key element of our policy.
Okay, I'm going to the idea was that we would, because it's a pretty full room, that we would let people in the audience direct questions, and I'm going to let that process sort of start off fairly right now if people want to put up their hands. I would ask you to wait until the microphone reaches you until you ask your question, and if you start off by identifying yourself, your affiliation, and indeed asking a question rather than making a declarative statement. That'd be great.
Thank you. Peter Sondry, National Council for Science and the Environment. First for Carol, but others can respond. So you've noted that Natural gas, and particularly its displacement of coal in the power sector, has been a huge part of emissions reductions. What assumptions have you made about natural gas going forward over the next 15 years? And what are the implications of that assumption for scaling up renewables and methane linkages?
Yes, thanks for coming, Peter. Our assumptions on natural gas supplies and pricing track the reference case projections in the AEO 2014. And so we don't assume changes from those trajectories. Clearly, the four building blocks of the Clean Power Plan will cause a mixture of both increases in natural gas use along with renewables and energy efficiency. Most of our projections assume that the state, consistent with EPA's projections, that the states will take advantage of all four building blocks. So we don't have explicit renewable additions beyond that in our core ambition pathway, but rather the Clean Power Plan projections show a significant increase in renewables and no disruptions or price pressure on the natural gas sector.
Could I add just something on this point, if that's okay, with respect to natural gas? Because I think one of the stories about natural gas that is an emerging story is because it's sometimes cast as natural gas versus renewables. But I think the interesting story is the impact of natural gas in distributed energy resources. So you're not going to put a coal plant next to your factory or your house or your office building, but you can't put a combined heat and power unit or a fuel cell. And one of the things that we've done for public health reasons is to move big coal plants away from and other large power plants away from population centers, but we lose a tremendous amount of the energy content in the form of heat that goes up the chimney. But
will New York State have to use more coal because of the fracking decision? Will that have any impact?
No, we don't have much coal as it is, and no, we're not going to have to use more coal. So the point that I want to make here is that using natural gas for distributed solutions, you use more of the energy content of the natural gas, but as a distributed solution, it ties into other solutions, of energy efficiency at the building level, and also again puts more pressure for policy changes that are going to enable other distributed resources like batteries or solar to build this integrated grid. So it's actually a real positive for reduction in emissions.
Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Sandra Madavu-Fry, DC People's Council. I have two questions. One is pretty generic or general in nature, and it goes directly to, stimulation of the economy. And, we hear from the industry, particularly the fossil industry, about the potential for loss of jobs. And I want to know, what are we doing in terms of stimulating, fostering, and promoting green jobs, and making certain that those jobs are available to consumers, to our residents. And that, in a way, offsets, one of the questions that was raised in terms of the increase in prices.
Did you have that question directed towards anyone in particular? Maybe to Rick?
Maybe Rick, anyone that can answer it. And then the second question would go to what's going on in New York.
I'll cut you off,
Yes.
and we can add, because that's a great question, and maybe we'd start with Rick, would have some thoughts, and others.
So thank you for the question. It's an important topic, and I think just to set the broad context, as we've seen a 20-time increase in solar and a huge increase in wind during the course of this administration, we've seen a lot of jobs come along with that. Same thing with the efforts to cut energy waste throughout the economy. Those also involve important jobs to do the home retrofits and to do the combined heat and power installations and to do what's required in order to cut energy waste throughout the economy. And Mark can probably speak to that in some depth, and we might want to give him a moment as well. But we see extraordinary opportunities for rapid, ongoing job growth in the renewable sector, the energy efficiency sector, and throughout the low-carbon solution set as states move to implement the Clean Power Plan. And I just want to note, as a follow-on to the prior question, and an echo of what Richard said, that a key part of the Clean Power Plan is that each state gets to decide how they want to implement the Clean Power Plan. And many states will want to focus intensively on renewables. Others will want to focus on a combination of renewables and nuclear and other technologies. And so we'll see lots of jobs come with that transformation in each state and ongoing job creation through the suite of policies that are already in place consistent with the Climate Action Plan.
Bit off topic, but what recourse is there against those states, the number of states who have said that they will not implement the Clean Power Plan? I mean, what happens then?
So I think it's important to just take stock of where we are in the process. The EPA has gone through a truly extraordinary public engagement process in developing the Clean Power Plan. And they've received millions of comments and are in the process now of working through those comments, taking on that input, and we're confident that they'll be finalizing a strong, legally robust rule that is appealing for states to adopt. And again, every state will have latitude to design a program that fits their conditions and their priorities and to deliver the standards that are set for their state by the EPA. So we're confident that once the rule is finalized this summer, that there will be strong interest across states in getting moving on accelerating the momentum that's already out there in the power sector, as some have already noted, and they'll have lots of latitude to do that in a way that works for their circumstances.
Thank you. Mark, did you want to? Oh.
And just add a quick comment to Rick's. I think that the jobs question is a very important one, and it's notably that EPA's regulatory impact analysis of the Clean Power Plan projects net job gains, I think, in the tens of thousands through implementation of the Clean Power Plan for just the reasons that Rick outlined.
Yeah, as Rick mentioned, you know, when we deploy an energy efficiency out in the field, projects out there, maybe on a commercial basis, it's not just, you know, some installation folks that are there. You've got project engineers designing the projects. It may be a large cogen plant that we're doing for a large facility, university, military base. You've got those installers in there, and a lot of, we'll go in and hire an awful lot of local subcontractors. These are a lot of local jobs that are out there because the jobs are where the buildings are, I always like to say, where our projects are. Let's also not forget about the manufacturing side of the business, not just the installations. You know, we make the air conditioners and chillers here in the United States, the efficient ones that are replacing the older, more outdated, inefficient ones. We make the batteries here in the United States, the advanced batteries in Toledo, Ohio, Holland, Michigan, St. Louis. All those, you know, those are local manufacturing jobs, and many other companies that are making energy efficient and renewable energy products out there here in the United States. Those are jobs that are going to also be created as well.
Hi, my name is James Bond, and I'm with the Green Climate Fund in Korea. And I have two questions very quickly. One is to Carl. I know this study is really done on the policy actions and whether they'll meet the targets or not. What I'd like to ask you is what's the price sensitivity of these? If we saw a decline or a long-term low energy price for fossil fuels, would that dramatically change the outcomes? And the second, I think, is more interesting. It's based on what Richard said. Richard's absolutely right about the potential for smart grids in terms of changing the configuration of energy generation, consumption, etc. Absolutely right. And actually, the thing is that the U.S. is quite behind
your
on
question,
smart grids. It is
please?
a question.
What?
It is a question. The U.S. is behind on smart grids in terms of its deployment. It sounds like it's new and it's rocket science. Smart grids are available in Europe, in Korea.
Well, please, if you could get to your question.
Mark, Richard, and Rick, what are the policy measures that are being undertaken or could be undertaken to accelerate the deployment of smart grids to achieve the emissions that you that the WRI has estimated possible?
Mark?
Answering on the first question, it was beyond the scope of the study to run different price trajectories on natural gas, oil prices, coal prices. And I think it would depend on what your scenario was. If natural gas prices remain low or go even lower, some parts of this plan would become easier. If supplies tighten and prices go up, then obviously some of the further backing out of coal and increasing natural gas would become more expensive. But I don't think the results are highly sensitive to some movement in natural gas prices. Other studies, especially if we look at the EIA analysis of the Clean Power Plan that just came out last week, explores some sensitivity on energy prices, and that's worth looking at.
And if we could get to, if people want to pick up on the smart grid question, what could be done to get the U.S. to catch up with Europe and other countries on the smart grid?
Okay, fine. So, the grid is a shared responsibility between state and federal authorities. Much of the part of the grid, however, that relates to around buildings and customers is really at the state level. And so that's up to each state. So what we are doing in New York State is profoundly changing the regulatory incentives for the utilities. So we've told the utilities that their job, in addition to delivering electricity, is to do a few things. Utilities in New York State don't own generation. They're just wires companies. And so they are now to become more capital efficient in how right now utilities only get paid for a profit based upon the quantum of capital that they invest. They get no incremental, they don't get paid based upon the amount of electricity people consume, but they get no compensation for any human capital. It's just physical capital. And if we want to know why it is that we're not deploying the best technology, is because given a choice, for example, between a pole which lasts 50 years and a piece of software which may not even be able to be capitalized, they'll always pick the pole because they get no profit on things that are not capital. So we're saying that they need to be more capital efficient. They need to integrate distributed resources where it's going to make sense for the grid. And we also want utilities to make investments in the network that's going to enable robust third-party competitors to offer services to customers. And when you add all those things together, it will lead to greater investments in this kind of networked infrastructure that I've tried to describe, which again looks a lot more like the IT system than the current grid that we have today.
And we're basically think of us on the demand side of the grid, if you will. So 2 points. A lot of what we're seeing, we've talked about it already, is a lot of our customers are really looking at, and we're already starting to install, we'll announce some projects later this week, on putting in cogen facilities. A lot of lessons learned from Sandy in terms of who still had lights on after a hurricane went through, or those who had cogen and were able to produce their own power. So folks are looking at it not only from an energy saving standpoint, because they're wrapping other efficiency measures into it, but as you mentioned before, a resiliency standpoint. So cogen, gas-fired cogen plants are becoming much more of an interest of our customers. The other side, let's say the building side of things, I always like to say a smart grid needs smart buildings at the end of the line, if you will. And being able to have had demand-side management capacity. So when it goes from 85 to 90, 95, 100 degrees at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, can you, as a large customer, a large institution of some sort, start shedding load? And to what extent can you do that without very impact to mission at all? To dim your lights 20%, to let the temperature in the room rise 2 degrees or throw, to start shedding loads in a different way, to be able to do that on a very programmatic basis, to be able to have that communication with that smart grid, to know when those price signals are coming, to know when those rates are going to come, to know when the utility says, I need you to shed some load right now, so I don't have to turn on that extra generator out there because we're starting to peak out. Those are the type of things that you'll be able to have when you have smart buildings and people with distributed generation out there in there to truly, I think, make this smart grid complete.
Yes, I just want, Mark is fantastic. I want to make it clear that the problem here is not the technology. The technology is here today. The problem is the regulatory structure which inhibits its adoption. So right now, as an example, demand response is a compliance matter that the utilities must do. It's not a business.
Maybe we can bring in Rick to talk about some of the policies or some of the regulatory structures that could help bring this in.
Sure, and I'll just say that this is an area where the dynamism of the U.S. private sector is clear, and my money's on the private sector for delivering solutions that are going to make this really an important part of how we deliver a low-cost, low-carbon infrastructure going forward. Richard's absolutely right that there's an important policy interface there as well. The President's been focused on this within a wide range of solutions that we need for the long-term transformation to low-carbon energy. This is one of the important tools in the kit. And so we've invested in that through the recovery program, important investment in smart meter technology, that's a key enabling technology. Also things like Synco phasers and a whole range of cutting edge technologies that will help us to deliver the kinds of savings that we're talking about here. We're continuing to budget for innovation in this space through the Department of Energy's Office of Electricity. And then there are important policy interfaces beyond that. FERC has given sustained attention to how to have the right sort of markets develop in this space, and we're broadly supportive of that work. And then under the Clean Power Plan, we expect that states will look to this as part of their toolkit to deliver the reductions and the clean energy that they want.
Thank you.
Yes, my name is David Bookbinder. I'm from Element 6, and I simply have a very simple yes or no question for Mr. Duke. Is there a publicly available document that describes how the laundry list of measures in the INDC will achieve 26 to 28% emissions reductions that are promised? And if not, why not?
So I think we'll all acknowledge that there are no simple answers in this line of work. Let me give a more complicated answer, but I think an important one, which is that when... Well, let me give a little more comprehensive context on this. So when we look at the overall climate negotiations, one of the things that the administration has prioritized and continues to prioritize and has achieved significant progress on is ensuring that transparency and accountability are core to the overall climate negotiations process. And that has delivered some really important elements that we expect to see feature in the Paris discussions as well. For example, there are, every 2 years now, every major economy is putting forward biennial reports. We did our first ever biennial report last year, and we have another one due now on the 2-year mark. And every major economy is now also providing that same transparency, that same accountability, and we think that's a critical feature of the international discussions on climate. And we intend to continue to fully comply with what we've negotiated there in terms of transparency and accountability on how we're doing on our climate targets. And so I would point you to, in the first instance, our biennial report, which provides important information with respect to our 2020 target. And I would invite you to stay tuned as we move forward to put forward our second biennial report on schedule with every other major economy. I think that this report from WRI is also consistent with our own internal assessment that we're on track for both our 2020 and our 2025 targets.
Yeah. Lady here.
Hi, Mallory Lee Wong, Johns Hopkins SAIS Master's candidate. This is a question for Carl or anyone else who'd like to comment. What are your underlying assumptions in your modeling about the deployment, the rate of deployment and the extent of use of CCS, and also the rate of retirement of nuclear plants? I know the AEO presents a variety of pathways that could significantly impact U.S. carbon emissions.
Mm-hmm. Yes, there again, we assume reference case projections from the AEO 2014 on both CCS and nuclear use and retirement.
Lucia Wu from NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. I've got 2 questions, if I may. One, how do we monitor and verify these emissions reductions? And does this action plan encompass Alaska and U.S. territories?
I think the L&D question is for Rick.
Rick, or I was going to actually sort of bring John in and see if he had any ideas for what's needed for monitoring, and then can come back to Alaska.
Well, I think, tracking U.S. emissions is fairly straightforward. I like to rely on WRI to do that. But there are many institutions that track U.S. emissions and look forward to what the policies are that would drive reductions. I tend to stay away from the EIA and others, which tend to not be very good at forecasting what's going to happen. If you're looking for a forecast of renewables, I recommend my former employer, Greenpeace. But I think that whether the U.S. is on track will be well known in the U.S. for quite some time. I don't think there's any shortage of institutions that are going to be willing and able to focus attention on any shortcomings that might or might not exist, frankly, including my institution, which tracks the coal plant shutdowns very carefully. And we constantly point out to the administration that they lag heavily on incorporating those decisions in their forecasting. So I think that's pretty much set. I guess I would leave the second question to others.
Yeah. Big picture, though, the monitoring is going to be a really big deal in the climate talks, isn't it, globally?
I think that's true, and I would say that where that's going to be a problem is not in the United States, but in other countries. I think there's a number of players, as I said before, that will track U.S. compliance with its targets, ranging the whole spectrum from evidently me way over on the right to Carl way over on the left. But I do think that, the bigger challenge is the transparency and accountability of other countries, and that's why the U.S. in the context of the negotiations has been very focused on a clear set of standards that applies to all players, so that all countries are putting forward not just what their target is, but what they're doing to accomplish it in the context of the biennial reports.
And Rick, did you want to weigh in there and then maybe go on to the Alaska question?
Sure. So I'll just broadly reinforce what John has said. Again, we view transparency and accountability as central to the climate discussions internationally. We pushed very hard to maximize transparency and accountability in the various agreements, and we'll do the same as we come forward to the Paris discussions. And so we'll also fully participate in everything that's agreed to, including the biennial reports, including the multilateral assessment process. Last December in Lima, I sat in the hot seat and discussed with the entire plenary how we're doing against our targets and took questions. And every country is now doing that, and that's critical to make sure that we've got broad transparency and accountability across all major economies in the whole world. So we feel very good about that process and the accountability that it brings. I would just note that with respect to our numbers, we have lots of systems to track our numbers, as John has indicated, and they come on different timescales and with different scopes. One important data point that's worth noting is that in the last 4 months, the Energy Information Administration literally comes out with monthly data on our energy CO2 emissions. And in the last 4 months, the first 4 months of this year, we've seen energy CO2 emissions down 3% from last year. So we track on monthly scales, on annual scales, everyone tracks, and there's lots of accountability for the U.S., and we need to make sure that's true on a global scale as well through the climate discussions. With respect to the Alaska question, not sure I fully understood the question, but we do work to take a nationwide approach to our overall climate action plan and to our efforts to drive down emissions.
I think Carl wanted to jump in on Alaska.
The WRI analysis, I'm 100% sure Alaska is in, and I'm fairly sure the territories are in, and I'm going to ask my other project team members to give me a thumbs up on territories or a thumbs down if I'm wrong. Let's see a couple of thumbs up. Thank you.
Okay. All right, I guess we can move on to another question.
Hi, George Frampton, Partnership for Responsible Growth. In trying to correlate your emissions reductions path pathways with existing policies. I wonder if you could clarify what your assumptions were for the power plant sector. It looks like your box, table 1 on page 13, that even the middle of the road as well as the go-getter scenarios assume a much greater reduction than the power plant rule would promise if fully implemented. Am I misreading this? This is 18% reduction by 2021 from 2012, but the power plant sector rule only envisions a 16% reduction by 2030.
Yeah, as we lay out in the full report, the reductions in the power sector in our 3 pathways include the effects of the Clean Power Plan, and then federal appliance standards and other federal programs we have treated as additive to what's going on at the state level in the Clean Power Plan. And we lay that out in detail in the report.
I saw there was somebody, a woman in the second row there.
Hi, I'm Rachel McCormick from the Canadian Embassy, and it's a really close question. I was actually wondering if WRI plans to update its analysis when the Clean Power Plan rule is finalized this summer.
I can't say for sure whether we will do that. Certainly, as Sam laid out in his remarks, we have been doing ongoing analysis of U.S. mitigation potential over the years, and I will say that I hope we have a chance to update this as we move forward.
Jeff Homestead with Bracewell and Giuliani. I just wanted to follow up on the answer about transparency and accountability. When the U.S.-China agreement was announced, I remember Mr. Podesta and Ms. McCarthy both said it was based on a careful analysis of all the things that could be done under existing law, and that's how the 26 to 28% reduction commitment was calculated. So my question, I guess, is a follow-up to David's. If there was that kind of an analysis that got to 26% or 28%, when will that be made available to the public?
Thank you for your question, and I'm glad that you raised the U.S.-China joint announcement. Let me just give quick context on that and then comment on the underlying basis for our 2025 target. So last November, President Obama and President Xi jointly announced a historic set of targets to cut emissions, and this is something that has had a galvanizing effect on the overall momentum in the context of the Paris negotiations. Since then, we've seen countries that represent over 60% of global energy CO2 emissions come forward with post-2020 emissions reduction targets. So lots of momentum, lots of movement to deploy low-carbon technologies and see their costs come down accordingly. India has since put forward a target of 175 gigawatts of renewables by 2022, which would mean well over 10% of their electricity would come from renewable energy by that year. So we see considerable momentum coming out of that joint announcement. And to get to the question of the development of the 26 to 28% target by 2025, we went through intensive dialogue with the different agencies in the administration about what's possible under existing authorities, existing statutes, in order to drive down emissions. The President has asked every agency to consider what they can do and to keep looking for options to drive down emissions, similar to what Secretary Vilsack has come forward to announce in the agriculture sector. And so in the run-up to the joint announcement, we conferred with the different agencies and looked closely at all the options across every sector and every gas under existing authorities to drive down emissions. As I've indicated, we're participating fully in the climate negotiations process, and we are pushing at every turn for common standards of transparency and accountability that all major economies are doing in lockstep. And we'll continue to push for those mechanisms in the context of the global negotiations. We'll continue to fully deliver on that transparency and accountability in lockstep with other countries as they move forward.
In fact,
someone midway. Okay.
Just to follow up on that.
Would you mind introducing
I'm
yourself,
sorry, I'm
please?
Jane Leggett from the Congressional Research Service. And appreciating the U.S. longstanding push for transparency and accountability under the Framework Convention, would it make sense for the United States to demonstrate the kind of transparency in detailing its commitment that we would like to see from other key countries like China and India?
So thank you for the question. The important perspective that we bring to this topic is that we need global action on what is a global challenge. And to make that happen in a sustained way over the years and decades where we need to see transformation towards a global low-carbon economy requires that all major economies participate fully in providing clear targets, ambitious and achievable targets, and guidance on how they're doing against those goals. And as other panelists have indicated, our numbers are quite clear, and it's really in other countries where we see more opportunity to clarify and document what's happening and what plans are. We need to make sure that we negotiate accordingly, and we'll continue to push for maximum transparency, and we'll continue to fully comply with what we've negotiated in that context. So again, I point to the multilateral assessment that I participated in Lima in the context of the climate negotiations just this past December, point to the biennial report that we put forward, our first ever biennial report, and forthcoming biennial reports, and the fact that all major economies are now doing the same kind of
Rick,
reporting.
can I just jump in and ask you to sort of spell out why, how this is such a complicated task, and perhaps spell out in layman's language why it's so difficult to figure out who's doing what in the climate negotiations? Why transparency and verification are such issues?
I'm happy to jump in here. So I would say that the thing that that we're sort of stepping around is that in a lot of countries we have poor or developing information just about the basic greenhouse gas emissions in those countries. What is industry contributing? What is the consumers and others contributing? So the basic thing that's negotiated is the entry level of accountability around what were the actual emissions and how are you doing to achieve the targets that you've set. That is not a question in the United States.
Right, but for other countries or globally, is there a uniform way of expressing these actions being taken?
So what hasn't been expected of countries is that they will spell out exactly how they will meet the emission reductions targets that they've pledged. This is a long ways off. These are actions that will be taken by future administrations. There are huge factors at play, including big switches away from coal and other resources that are global. There are ongoing questions about what future role Congress and others will play, and all of those factors mean that we'll have to adapt as we move forward. We know that it will be difficult to meet this target in the US. We know that it will be difficult to meet the target that the EU set. And I don't think that anyone expects that this administration will say, here is the playbook, here's exactly how we'll meet the target. That is why WRI did this report, to show that there are a multitude of options. And in the future, I think you will see the administration laying out additional policies that they will follow to achieve those targets. We'll see future administrations do that, and we'll potentially see an acceleration of emission reductions in response to those changes. But nowhere in the UNFCCC process, or frankly in our domestic political process, do we expect parties to lay out what they're going to do 10 years forward.
So that's the clear point, that there is no uniform way of expressing the targets, and there's no, diktat coming out from the top down.
There is not.
Yep. I think the person, we'll go to people who haven't asked questions yet, I think.
Mr. Duke, I'd like to ask for I think it's the fourth time, could you answer directly and simply the question of when are you going to release the assumptions that are behind your 26 to 28% reduction so that we can evaluate and audit their reasonableness? And I don't want you to answer any other question but that one.
So I think when we look at the overall climate action plan, we've laid out in the climate action plan itself and in our formal submission of our intended nationally determined contribution, as it's called in the UN context, the different statutory authorities and the different measures that are part. So as I was just saying, we've laid out quite a bit of detail in the Climate Action Plan itself and in our intended nationally determined contribution, the different statutory authorities and the different measures that we'll be pursuing in order to deliver our 2020 and 2025 emissions reduction goals. And so that includes things like the Clean Power Plan, a second phase of heavy-duty vehicle standards. It includes 3 gigatons worth of emissions reductions from appliance efficiency and equipment efficiency, and additional reductions from building codes determinations. It includes important progress on HFC reduction, on methane reductions, and all of these things are part of what we put forward publicly and which we will then continue to report on as we proceed. So this summer, we'll see the EPA finalize the Clean Power Plan, and important new information will be part of that final rule and can be factored into everyone's assessment of how we're doing against our overall goals. Same thing applies to every appliance efficiency standard that the Department of Energy will bring forward with attendant energy waste reductions, consumer savings, and carbon pollution reductions. Same thing with the EPA's Significant New Alternatives Policy Program, or SNAP program, to reduce HFCs, which, by the way, we're working very importantly on both the domestic and the international front to address HFC emissions. And that's an important part of the 10 elements in the WRI report, and I want to just comment on that briefly while I have the chance, or perhaps later.
I'm being told that there's one question, and there's time for one more question, which we can take from the system. From the floor. And then I actually wanted to get in a quick question on my own. We'll see how long this one takes.
Hi, Alan Greenberg, U.S. Department of Transportation. Just, Rick, on an earlier point you made about tapping all authority and so forth to go to look at other sectors. I believe it's a Center for Public Integrity out of NYU put out something that suggested that there would be broad authority under 2 parts of the Clean Air Act. I believe Section 115 involving the regulation of internationally recognized pollutants, and 211 for fuels. And the theory is that you could do an economy-wide regulatory approach based on the authority from these 2 sections. And I'm wondering whether that's been looked at either by you or Carl or John, and if you had any comments on that. Thank you.
I don't have any comment on this.
So, I'm happy to answer the question. Certainly on Section 115, there's been ongoing discussion both on the Hill and in the environmental community for some time that authority exists. It certainly offers the potential for a broad approach. I think that right now it's pretty clear where the administration is heading under Section 111. I think that the amount of energy and the time that's gone in to set those standards and the process that launches going forward, shows that they are not intending to move forward under Section 115, but nevertheless that authority does remain, and it is a potential backstop in the future and potential way to get broader emission reductions if we continue to need to use administration authority in the post-2025 period.
If no one wanted to sort of weigh in, I think I would close out by just if I could ask anyone, if anybody here, what they saw the prospects for getting action from Congress or involvement from Congress between now and November 2016, if anyone thought that was remotely a reality or that could happen. Carl, it's on your to-do list.
I would doubt it between now and November 2016.
Both the House and Senate are looking at some energy bills this year. Both of them have titles to promote energy efficiency. It's yet to be seen whether they can make it across the finish line.
Come on, you can be the optimist.
Well, I can try. Congress is absolutely going to take some action on energy in the coming, I guess basically year at this point. Whether it will impact the world, I think, is the real question. We saw the Senate pass a bill with 2 senators on the floor after years of trying on energy efficiency. So we know there's some creativity at play. But I think in the end, something meaningful, something that actually made a difference, I don't think that's in the cards.
For a second there, I thought you were going to stop us from ending on a down note.
But post-2016, everything's possible.
So I do want to make a point, if I could, though, which is that some of the things that we're talking about that are going on in the market and from a technology standpoint are happening irrespective of whether Congress acts. So the costs of distributed solutions, batteries, solar, fuel cells, all that stuff is going down, in some cases exponentially. So the utility business model is under pressure. And so the customers are wanting to have more control over their energy. They want to have, whether it's resiliency or independence, this is not going to change. And so the question is not, can these forces be stopped? It's a question of what's the opportunity cost in terms of time, what's the cost in terms of opportunity cost in terms of economic development, and how much economic destruction of value is going to take place. Those are the questions.
May I say something
Upbeat? Yeah.
I just want to note that, as Sam noted in his remarks, across the states we have dozens of renewable portfolio standards, energy efficiency resource standards, we have public benefit funds, and those are spread across blue states, red states, purple states. So there's a lot of action going on at the state level to increase renewable energy, increase energy efficiency, capture the economic benefits, capture the job benefits, and it cuts across parties, and we expect that to continue.
Please join me in thanking Suzanne and our panel for a great discussion, lively discussion. Thank you for being here today, and we will see you again soon.